The bunker stretched beneath Manhattan's ruins like a tomb waiting to be filled. 17 levels deep, carved from bedrock and desperation, it housed what remained of humanity's eastern seaboard. The air recyclers hummed their mechanical lullaby, a sound that had become as familiar as breathing to those who called this place home. Or prison, depending on how you looked at it. The war had started with promises of peace. First contact, the moment humanity had dreamed of for centuries, had come wrapped in honeyed words and technological gifts. The Kitha, the Sikh hegemony, arrived in sleek silver vessels that hung in Earth's sky like jeweled ornaments, beautiful and terrible. Their ambassadors spoke of unity, of bringing humanity into a greater galactic community. What they hadn't mentioned was the price of admission. Submit or be cleansed. That was the hegemony's doctrine, spoken in 100 different languages across 1,000 conquered worlds. Earth's governments had tried to negotiate. They'd offered resources, knowledge, even territory. But the hegemony wanted something more fundamental. They wanted humanity's spirit, broken and remade in their image. They'd underestimated what they were asking for. Marcus's fingers traced the scar along his jawline, a souvenir from the Battle of Chicago. He'd been a construction foreman before the war, building things, creating something from nothing. Now he built shelters, hiding places, tombs for the living. The irony wasn't lost on him. The bunker's lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. Power was getting scarce, even with the geothermal taps they'd managed to install. Everything was getting scarce. Food, medicine, hope. A soft chime echoed through the corridor, followed by Director Walsh's voice over the intercom. All section leaders to command. Priority Alpha. Marcus straightened. Priority Alpha meant one of two things. Either they'd received word from the surface resistance, or the hegemony had found them. Given the vibrations he'd been feeling, he suspected it was the latter. The walk to command took him through the heart of the bunker, past the hydroponics labs where Dr. Elena Vasquez coaxed vegetables from synthetic soil, past the workshops where Tommy Singh and his team turned scrap metal into weapons, past the medical bay where too many beds lay empty and too many remained occupied. 3,000 souls called this place home. 3,000 humans who'd refused to kneel. Command was a circular chamber at the bunker's heart, lined with screens that showed feeds from the surface. Most displayed static now, their cameras destroyed or compromised, but a few still functioned, offering glimpses of a world that no longer belonged to them. Director Walsh stood at the central console, her gray hair pulled back in its characteristic bun, her weathered hands steady despite the weight she carried. Around her, the other section leaders gathered: Martinez from engineering, Patel from security, Dr. Kim from medical, the usual suspects in humanity's last stand. Report, Walsh said without preamble. She'd never been one for small talk, even before the war. Now every word was currency they couldn't afford to waste. Martinez spoke first. Seismic sensors are picking up movement patterns. Large formations, approaching from 3 vectors. Whatever's up there, it's coordinated. How long do we have? This from Patel, already calculating defensive positions. Hard to say. Could be hours. Could be minutes. Walsh nodded, her expression unreadable. She turned to one of the few functioning surface monitors, squinting at the grainy image it provided. Through the static, shapes moved, tall, graceful figures in armor that seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury. Kathai ground forces. They've found us, she said quietly. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. They'd always known this day would come. The bunker was well hidden, its entrances camouflaged, its electronic signature minimal. But the hegemony had time, resources, and technology that made human efforts seem like children playing with sticks. Evacuation protocols. Dr. Kim's voice was steady, professional. She'd been a trauma surgeon before the war, and she approached catastrophe with the same clinical detachment she'd once reserved for the operating room. Where would we go? Walsh's smile was bitter. This is it. This is our line. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd helped design this bunker, knew its strengths and weaknesses better than anyone. It could withstand conventional assault, even nuclear bombardment. But the hegemony didn't use conventional weapons. They used conversion fields. quantum disruptors. Technologies that turned matter into energy and energy into whatever they desired. Against that kind of power, 17 levels of reinforced concrete might as well be tissue paper. A new alarm began to sound, long, mournful notes that meant the outer sensors had been triggered. On the screens, movement became visible. Dozens of figures in flowing armor, moving with predatory grace toward entry points that shouldn't have existed anymore. "Sir," Martinez's voice cracked slightly. "They're not using the main entrances." "What do you mean?" They're making new ones." The screens showed impossible geometry. Holes opening in solid rock, edges smooth as glass. The hegemony forces flowed through like water, their movements synchronized, purposeful, beautiful and terrifying. He was seeing it now. "They're scared," he said aloud, surprising himself. "We killed a lot of their people in Chicago," Patel offered. Before anyone could respond, the bunker shuddered. Dust rained from the ceiling and several screens went dark. The conversion fields were active, eating through the upper levels like acid through flesh. "How long until they reached the civilian sectors?" Walsh's voice was steady, but Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders. "Or 30 minutes to make their last stand mean something." "All hands to defensive positions," Walsh ordered. "Activate the deadman protocols. If we're going down, we're taking as many of those bastards with us as we can." The next few minutes blurred together in a cacophony of alarms, running feet, and shouted orders. Marcus found himself in Section C7, checking the improvised barricades his team had spent months perfecting. Behind him, families huddled in reinforced alcoves, parents holding children who didn't quite understand why everyone was so frightened. The ceiling shuddered again, closer this time. Then the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in hellish red. In that crimson glow, Marcus saw something that made his blood freeze. A hole was opening in the floor, not breaking through but simply appearing, as if reality had decided that solid matter was optional. Smooth edges, perfect geometry, and beyond it, darkness. Then she fell through. It wasn't a combat drop or a tactical insertion. She simply tumbled from the hole like a discarded doll, hitting the floor with a sound that was part impact, part sob. Her armor, if it could be called armor, was shattered, revealing patches of pale skin marked with burns and cuts. She was young, and possibly heartbreakingly young, with features that were almost human but not quite too angular, too perfect, with eyes like fragments of starlight. Her hair was the color of moonbeams, and it was matted with blood. HFY blood was silver. She raised her head, those impossible eyes meeting his, and spoke a single word in accented English. "Please." Marcus stared at her, his rifle trained on her chest, his finger on the trigger. Everything he'd been taught, everything he'd learned in 3 years of war, screamed at him to shoot. The HFY were the enemy. They'd killed billions. They'd turned his world into a charnel house. But looking at her broken, bleeding, terrified, he saw something else. He saw himself in the ruins of Chicago, calling out to anyone who might listen, begging for help that never came. The hole in the floor began to close, sealing with the same impossible smoothness it had appeared with. Whatever had happened up there, she'd been thrown away, discarded, left behind. She tried to stand, faltered, and collapsed again. Her breathing was ragged, and Marcus could see that some of her wounds were serious. Without medical attention, she'd die. The smart move would be to let her. The human move was something else entirely. Marcus lowered his rifle and took a step forward. The alien girl, because that's what she was, despite the armor and the silver blood, she was just a girl, watched him approach with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. "I won't hurt you," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. When was the last time he'd spoken to a HFY who wasn't trying to kill him? She said something in her own language, liquid syllables that sounded like singing. Then, seeming to remember where she was, she switched back to English. "You should," she whispered. "I would if our positions were reversed." The honesty in her voice hit him like a physical blow. No deception, no manipulation, just truth, raw and painful. "What's your name?" he asked. She was quiet for so long, he thought she might not answer. Then Zithika. It sounded like wind through crystal chimes. "I'm Marcus." Another pause. "Marcus." She tested the name, her accent making it sound exotic. A common human designation. Yeah, well, common human guy. Despite everything, the war, the bunker, the fact that her people were currently trying to kill his, she almost smiled. Almost. Then the pain hit her again, and she doubled over, silver blood pooling beneath her. Marcus made his choice. He activated his comm unit. Dr. Kim, to Section C7. Medical emergency. Marcus? What the hell? Just come. Please. He knelt beside Zithkara, close enough to see the intricate patterns etched into her armor, close enough to smell something like cinnamon and starlight on her breath. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Why, she asked. It was a good question. Why help someone whose people had turned his world into hell? Why risk everything for a stranger who might betray him at the first opportunity? Marcus looked around Section C7 at the families huddled in the alcoves, at the makeshift barricades, at the red emergency lights that made everything look like a scene from a horror movie. This was what they'd been reduced to. This was what humanity had become, hiding in holes, fighting for scraps, afraid of the dark. Zithkara stared at him for a long moment. Then she closed her eyes and whispered something in her own language that sounded like a prayer. Dr. Kim arrived minutes later, took one look at the scene and stopped dead. Marcus, she said slowly, please tell me you have not lost your damn mind. Probably, he admitted. Will you help her? Kim's professional instincts warred visibly with 3 years of hatred. The professional one. Barely. Get her to the medical bay and Marcus? Yeah. If this goes bad, I'm blaming you. Fair enough. As they lifted Zithkara between them, Marcus caught a glimpse of something etched into the wall above where she'd fallen. Symbols in the flowing script of the Kethkatve burned into the metal as if by incredible heat. He didn't know what they said, but somehow he knew they were important. The bunker shuddered again, and somewhere in the distance alarms began to wail. The hegemony forces were getting closer, eating their way through layers of stone and steel, hunting the humans who dared to resist. And in Medical Bay 3, Dr. Kim worked to save the life of one of their own. Marcus stood guard outside, his rifle ready, his mind reeling with questions he couldn't answer. Why had she fallen through that hole? Why was she injured? Why did her people seem to be hunting her as much as they were hunting his? Most importantly, what did it mean that she was here now when everything was falling apart? The lights flickered again, and Marcus could swear he felt the weight of 17 levels of earth and stone pressing down on him. Somewhere above, the hegemony continued their methodical advance. Somewhere below, an enemy became something else entirely. And in the space between those two certainties, Marcus Reeves began to understand that the war was about to change in ways no one could have predicted. The hole in the floor was gone, sealed as if it had never existed, but the symbols remained, glowing faintly in the emergency lighting, like a message from a future that hadn't been written yet. In Medical Bay 3, Zithkara opened her eyes and spoke a name that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. Kethmaran, or in human terms, a traitor. The Medical Bay had become a war zone of a different kind. Dr. Kim worked with the focused intensity of someone who'd spent years patching humans back together. But HFY physiology was proving to be a challenge that tested even her considerable skills. Silver blood pooled on the surgical table, and monitors designed for human vital signs gave readings that made no sense. Her cardiovascular system is completely different, Kim muttered, her hands steady despite the impossibility of what she was doing. 3 hearts, redundant circulation pathways, and something that might be a backup nervous system. Marcus stood at the observation window watching the woman who'd called herself Zithkara drift in and out of consciousness. In the harsh light of the medical bay, she looked even younger, barely out of adolescence by human standards, though he had no idea how HFY aging worked. Behind him, Director Walsh's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. You brought a hegemony operative into our bunker, into our medical facility, while we're under attack. She's not an operative, Marcus said without turning around. Look at her, Director. Look at her wounds. Someone did that to her. Someone who wanted her dead. Her own people, most likely. Which raises the question, What did she do that was bad enough for the hegemony to discard her like garbage? It was a fair point, one that Marcus had been wrestling with since the moment Zithkara had fallen through that impossible hole. The Kethboe were disciplined, hierarchical. They didn't abandon their own without cause. So what had she done? The answer came sooner than he expected. Zithkara's eyes fluttered open, those starlight irises focusing on him through the observation glass. Her lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear. Marcus activated the intercom. "What did you say?" "The children," she whispered. I wouldn't." Her voice trailed off, but something in her expression, grief, shame, defiance, told Marcus everything he needed to know. "She refused an order," he said quietly. "Something involving civilians." Walsh stepped up beside him. "How can you possibly know that?" "Because I've seen that look before. In the mirror after Chicago." The Battle of Chicago had been humanity's first major victory against the hegemony and its most prolific. They'd stopped a Kethboe advance, but the cost had been horrific. Entire city blocks turned to ash, families buried under rubble. Victory paid for in blood and nightmares. Marcus had been there when the order came down to target civilian evacuation routes. The tactical justification was sound: cut off the enemy's retreat, force them into a killing ground. But those routes were packed with human refugees, people fleeing the fighting. He'd refused. Court-martial had followed. Then disgrace, then exile to bunker construction duty. The brass had made it clear that sentiment was a luxury they couldn't afford in wartime. Looking at Zithkara, he wondered if the hegemony had reached the same conclusion. The bunker shuddered again, more violently this time. Through the intercom he could hear shouting from the upper levels, the distinctive whine of energy weapons, the sound of structural supports giving way. "Report," Walsh spoke into her comm unit. Martinez's voice crackled back. "They're through level 8. Conversion fields are eating through the infrastructure faster than we calculated. At this rate, they'll reach the civilian sectors in 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Marcus looked at Zithkara, still pale and broken on the medical table, and made another choice that would probably get him killed. "I need to talk to her." "Marcus. She knows them, Director. Their tactics, their capabilities, maybe even their weaknesses. If there's any chance she can help us." Walsh stared at him for a long moment. Then she nodded toward the medical bay door. 5 minutes. Then she gets sedated and locked down. The medical bay smelled like antiseptic and desperation. Up close, Zithkara looked even more fragile. Her skin had a translucent quality that revealed the network of silver vessels beneath, and her breathing was shallow, labored. But her eyes were alert, watching him with an intelligence that made him uncomfortable. "You're dying," she said without preamble. "Your people, in this place. You're dying slowly, like flames without oxygen." She struggled to sit up, failed, settled for turning her head toward him. "How many are here?" "Why do you care?" "Because I've seen what happens to worlds that resist the hegemony. I've done what happens to worlds that resist." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of confession. 17 planets, 43 billion souls, all converted or cleansed. The numbers hit Marcus like physical blows. 43 billion. It was more than Earth's entire population before the war. "And now?" he asked. "Now I can't." She met his eyes, and he saw something there that he recognized. The look of someone who'd been asked to cross a line they couldn't come back from. "They brought me children, Marcus. HFY children who'd been exposed to human media, human culture. They'd started questioning the doctrine, started asking why we couldn't coexist instead of convert. What was your order?" "Cleanse them, publicly, as an example to others who might harbor such thoughts." Her voice broke on the last word. "They were barely past their first molting. Equivalent to your 8 years old?" Marcus felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. He'd known the hegemony was ruthless. But this was something else entirely. "I refused, and they cast me out, marked me as Kathmiran, one who chooses dishonor over duty. They threw me into the conversion void, expecting me to dissolve into component atoms." She managed a bitter smile. "Instead, I fell through dimensional barriers into your shelter. Lucky us. Marcus said, though he wasn't sure luck was the right word. The bunker shook again, and the lights flickered. Through the walls he could hear the sound of energy weapons. Closer now. Marcus, Zithkara said, urgently. The force attacking you, how large? Sensors show maybe 60 individuals. She shook her head. Show me the readings. Against his better judgment, Marcus activated a portable tactical display, showing her the sensor data from the upper levels. She studied it for perhaps 10 seconds, then closed her eyes. This is not a cleansing force, she said quietly. What do you mean? 60 soldiers to assault a hardened position containing 3,000 humans. That's not an attack formation, that's a retrieval team. She looked at him with eyes that held too much knowledge and too much pain. The implications hit Marcus like a sledgehammer. If Zithkara was right, then the hegemony wasn't here to destroy the bunker. They were here to recover a defector who possessed information they couldn't afford to lose. Which meant 3,000 human lives were about to be sacrificed as collateral damage in an alien manhunt. What do you know that scares them so much, he asked. Everything, she said simply. Deployment schedules, conversion protocols, dimensional gateway codes. I was part of the Strategic Planning Council for this entire sector. And she'd fallen, quite literally, into humanity's lap. The symbols, Marcus said suddenly. The ones burned into the wall where you appeared, what do they say? Zithkara's expression darkened. They're a warning. A message left by the conversion void as I passed through the dimensional barriers. Translated roughly, they say, the fire spreads, the foundation crumbles. The harvest approaches. The harvest. The hegemony's endgame for Earth. They've been studying your species for 3 years, learning your weaknesses, your breaking points. Soon they'll stop trying to convert you individually and simply harvest what they need from your collective consciousness. That's impossible. Is it? She struggled to sit up again, managing it this time despite Dr. Kim's protests from across the room. You've seen their technology, Marcus. Conversion fields that transform matter at the quantum level. Dimensional manipulation that lets them appear anywhere they choose. What makes you think consciousness is beyond their reach? The answer was nothing. Absolutely nothing. Marcus activated his comm unit. Director Walsh, to Medical Bay 3. Priority Alpha? Walsh arrived within minutes, took one look at Zithkara sitting upright, and drew her sidearm. She's not a prisoner, she's an asset. She's a security risk who's been compromised by enemy action. She's the key to winning this war. The words hung in the air between them. Walsh's expression didn't change, but her finger moved away from the trigger. Explain. Marcus looked at Zithkara, who nodded slightly. Tell her, the alien said quietly. Tell her what's coming. So Marcus did. He told Walsh about the retrieval team, about the harvest protocol, about the intelligence Zithkara carried in her head. He watched the director's expression change from skepticism to understanding, to something that might have been hope. When he finished, Walsh was quiet for a long moment. Can you prove any of this? She asked Zithkara. In response, the HFY placed her hand on the medical scanner, activating systems that shouldn't have responded to alien biology. Data cascaded across the screen, tactical readouts, deployment schedules, dimensional coordinates. All of it in perfect readable English. How? Walsh breathed. Universal translation protocols, Zithkara explained. Every hegemony operative carries them. The irony is that you can use them to read our data as easily as we read yours. The bunker shuddered again, and this time the lights went out completely. Emergency power kicked in a second later, but the message was clear. The hegemony forces had reached the main power distribution center. How long do we have? Walsh asked. Zithkara closed her eyes, seemingly listening to something only she could hear. They're moving faster now. They've detected the translation protocols I just activated. Maybe 10 minutes before they reach this level. Then we evacuate, full defensive withdrawal to the deep levels. Director, Marcus said quietly, there are no deep levels. This is as far down as we go. The weight of that statement settled over them like a shroud. 17 levels down, carved from Manhattan bedrock, surrounded by 3 years of the most sophisticated defenses humanity could devise. And none of it would matter. There is another way, Zithkara said hesitantly. Walsh and Marcus turned to her. The dimensional void that brought me here. It's still partially open. The symbols on the wall are maintaining a connection. If we could stabilize it, expand it. You're talking about evacuation through dimensional space, Walsh said. To where? There are places. Pocket dimensions between realities. The hegemony uses them for storage, for staging areas. Most are empty. Some are large enough to hold thousands. Marcus stared at her. You're suggesting we abandon Earth entirely. I'm suggesting you survive long enough to take it back. The bunker shook again, more violently than before. Through the intercom they could hear gunfire from the upper levels. Human weapons, desperate and defiant. She turned back to Zethkara. This dimensional evacuation. How do we make it work? The symbols are the key. They're more than writing. They're quantum encryption, maintaining the void portal's coherence. With the right modifications, the right power source. What kind of power source? A suicide mission. Yes. Marcus felt the pieces clicking together in his mind. The retrieval team. The harvest protocol. The dimensional portal that had appeared exactly where it was needed, when it was needed. This wasn't an accident, he said slowly. You falling through that hole, it wasn't random. Zithkara met his eyes, and he saw confirmation there. The implications were staggering. A member of the hegemony's strategic council faced with execution for refusing to murder children had somehow convinced a dimensional weapon to transport her across impossible distances to the one place where her knowledge could make a difference. It sounded like science fiction. It sounded insane. It sounded like hope. Walsh looked at the tactical display, at the sensor readings showing hegemony forces closing in from 3 directions. Do it, she said. Director. Do it, Marcus. Get our people out of here. What about the power source? Someone has to stay behind. I'll stay. The voice came from the medical bay entrance. Dr. Kim stood there, her medical bag in one hand, a determined expression on her face. Elena. No. I'm 63 years old, Marcus. I've got maybe 10 good years left, and that's if we survive the next 10 minutes. 3,000 people, including children, versus one old woman who's already lived her life. She smiled sadly. That's not a difficult equation. There has to be another way. There is no other way. Kim's voice carried 3 years of accumulated grief and rage. Look around you, Marcus. Look at what we've been reduced to. Hiding in holes, scavenging for scraps, watching our children grow up in darkness. This is our chance, maybe our only chance, to give them something better. The bunker convulsed, and the sound of energy weapons grew louder. Walsh activated the general comm system. All personnel, this is Director Walsh. Prepare for emergency evacuation. Repeat, prepare for emergency evacuation. Full kit, essential personnel only. You have 5 minutes. She turned to Zethkara. What do you need to make this work? Access to the symbols. A direct neural interface with the portal matrix. And she hesitated. And trust. If this goes wrong, if the portal collapses or sends you to the wrong dimension, you'll all die horribly, possibly worse than dying. Marcus laughed. A sound devoid of humor. Lady, we're already dying horribly. At least your way, we get to do it together. The next few minutes blurred together in controlled chaos. Families streamed down from the upper levels, carrying children and essentials, trying to process the impossible reality that they were about to abandon everything they'd built. In Section C7, Marcus and a team of engineers worked to clear a path to the symbols burned into the wall. They were more extensive than he'd first realized, covering nearly 50 square meters, flowing and shifting like living text. Zithkara stood before them, her injuries forgotten in the face of what she was attempting. She pressed her palms against the wall and the symbols began to glow. The portal is responding, she said, her voice strained. But it's not stable. The quantum matrix is fluctuating. What does that mean? It means we might end up scattered across 17 different dimensions, or compressed into a single point of light. An explosion much closer than before cut her off. Through the ceiling, Marcus could see the distinctive blue-white glow of conversion fields. They were out of time. Dr. Kim, Walsh's voice over the comm, "Are you ready?" Kim's response was steady. "Ready. Zithkara." Beginning neural interface now. The alien pressed her forehead against the symbols, and they flared with brilliant light. The wall began to dissolve, revealing not rock or earth behind it, but nothing. A yawning void that seemed to swallow light itself. "Portal is stabilizing," Zithkara said through gritted teeth. "Beginning evacuation sequence." The first group of civilians stepped toward the portal. Families with children, elderly residents, the wounded. They looked terrified, but they moved forward anyway, disappearing into that impossible darkness. Then the next group, and the next. 3,000 people filing through a hole in reality, leaving behind the only world they'd ever known. Marcus stood at the portal's edge, watching his people disappear into the unknown. Behind him he could hear the sound of hegemony forces breaching the lower levels. He shook his head. "Someone needs to help Dr. Kim with the power transfer." "That's not, Director. With respect, that's exactly how this works. You get our people to safety. I make sure they stay safe." Walsh stared at him for a moment, then nodded. "It's been an honor, Marcus." "Same to you." She stepped through the portal, and Marcus was alone with Zithkara and Dr. Kim. Well, not entirely alone. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridors, measured, purposeful, getting closer with each second. "How long to complete the evacuation?" Marcus asked. "Another minute, maybe two," Dr. Kim replied. She was connected to the portal matrix now, her life force feeding the dimensional gateway, keeping it stable. "And how long until our guests arrive?" 30 seconds. The footsteps stopped just outside section C7. Then a voice, speaking perfect English with only the slightest alien accent. "Zithkara, we know you're in there. Come out, and we'll make this quick for the humans." Zithkara's eyes opened, meeting Marcus's gaze. In them he saw pain, determination, and something else. Something that looked like peace. "My name," she said quietly, "is Kethimira now. The one who chooses death over dishonor." The portal flared brighter, and the last group of evacuees, engineers, security personnel, the people who'd stayed behind to help others escape, stepped through into the void. Now it was just the three of them. "Final offer, Zithkara," the voice called. "Surrender now and we'll grant you the mercy of proper execution." "Tempting," she called back. "But I think I'll pass." The wall exploded inward, and hegemony soldiers flowed through the breach like liquid death. Marcus opened fire, his rifle chattering in the confined space, and was amazed to see one of the soldiers actually stagger. Then return fire lit up the room and everything went to hell. Energy bolts seared the air around him. Marcus dove for cover behind an overturned table, continuing to fire at targets that moved too fast and were too well armored. It was like trying to stop a tsunami with a water pistol. But he kept firing anyway, because that's what humans did. They fought impossible odds with inadequate weapons and called it Tuesday. Dr. Kim screamed, not in pain but in effort, pouring more of herself into the portal matrix. The dimensional gateway flared nova bright and Marcus felt the pull of it, the promise of escape. But someone had to close it behind them. Someone had to make sure the hegemony couldn't follow. "Go!" Zithkara shouted over the weapons fire. "Both of you, I can maintain the portal long enough." "Like hell," Marcus snarled back, ejecting his spent magazine and slamming home a fresh one. "We all go or nobody goes." But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. The portal was already starting to fluctuate, its edges wavering like heat shimmer. Dr. Kim's life force was burning out, consumed by the impossible energy requirements of dimensional travel, and the hegemony soldiers were advancing, their superior numbers and technology overwhelming his desperate defense. One of them spoke, its voice cutting through the chaos with mechanical precision. "Zithkara of the Strategic Council, you are charged with treason against the hegemony, dereliction of sacred duty, and corruption by inferior species ideology. Surrender, and your death will be swift." "Counteroffer," Zithkara replied, her hands still pressed against the portal matrix, silver blood streaming from her nose and ears as the dimensional energies tore at her. "Go to whatever hell your people believe in, and take your sacred duty with you." The soldier. Marcus could see now that it was larger than the others. Its armor more ornate, probably some kind of commander, raised what looked like a crystalline weapon. So be it. Execute all three. Retrieve the intelligence data from the corpses. Time slowed to a crawl. Marcus saw the weapon charge, saw the inevitable beam of energy that would reduce him to component atoms. He saw Dr. Kim collapse as the portal matrix drained the last of her strength. He saw Zithkara turn toward him, her starlight eyes wide with something that might have been regret. And then the portal exploded, not outward but inward, collapsing in on itself with a sound like reality tearing. The hegemony soldiers were caught in the dimensional backwash. Their perfect armor no protection against forces that existed outside normal space-time. They didn't scream, they simply ceased. Marcus felt the pull of collapsing dimensions, felt himself being stretched across impossible distances. The last thing he saw was Zithkara, her form already fading as she was pulled into the void, mouthing words he couldn't hear but somehow understood. "I'm sorry." Then everything went white. And then everything went black. Nothing. Marcus woke to the sound of children laughing. For a moment, he lay still, convinced he was dreaming. Children didn't laugh in bunkers. Children in bunkers whispered, cried, sometimes screamed when the nightmares got too bad. But they didn't laugh. Not like this. Not with pure, uncomplicated joy. He opened his eyes to find himself lying on grass. Real grass, green and soft beneath his fingers. Not the synthetic substitutes they'd tried to grow in the hydroponics labs. Above him a sky stretched endlessly blue, dotted with clouds that looked like they belonged in a painting. And in that sky, 3 suns burned with gentle light. "You're awake." The voice was familiar. Marcus turned his head and saw Dr. Elena Kim sitting beside him, looking exactly as she had in the bunker, except for the absence of lines around her eyes, the silver that was gone from her hair, the vitality that seemed to radiate from her like heat from a fire. "Elena? But you." He struggled to sit up, his head spinning. "The portal. You were dying." "I was. I did." She smiled, and it was the most peaceful expression Marcus had ever seen. Dimensional space doesn't work quite the same way as normal physics. Death is negotiable here. Marcus looked around, trying to process what he was seeing. They were in a valley of sorts, surrounded by rolling hills covered in impossible colors, flowers that shifted through the spectrum like living jewels, trees whose leaves sang in harmonies that made his chest ache with beauty. And everywhere, scattered across the valley floor, were people. His people, families from the bunker, sitting on blankets beneath alien trees, sharing food that looked nothing like their old rations, but smelled like everything good he'd ever tasted. "How many?" he asked quietly. "All of them," Kim said. "Every single person who went through the portal, 3,000 souls, safe and whole." "And Zithkara?" Kim's expression grew somber. "She's here. But Marcus, she paid a price for getting us out. The dimensional backlash, channeling that much energy. She's not the same." Marcus struggled to his feet, swaying slightly as his body remembered how to work in normal gravity. Across the valley he could see a figure sitting alone beneath a tree whose bark looked like crystallized music. Even at a distance he recognized the moonbeam hair, the too pale skin, but as he approached he could see what Kim meant. Zithkara looked diminished. Not physically, if anything her injuries had healed completely. But something essential had been burned out of her, some vital spark that had made her more than just another refugee in paradise. Her starlight eyes tracked his approach, but they were empty now. Windows into a house where nobody lived anymore. "Hello, Marcus," she said quietly. "I'm glad you survived the transition." "Zethkara. That's not my name anymore." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "Names are for people who have purposes. I'm just here." Marcus sat down beside her, trying to find words for the grief that was welling up in his chest. This woman, this alien who'd sacrificed everything to save his people, had become a ghost of herself in the process. "What did you lose?" he asked. "Everything that made me HFY. My connection to the hegemony's quantum network, my genetic memory, my sense of purpose." She looked at him with those empty eyes. "Do you know what it's like to suddenly not know who you are?" Actually, he did. The feeling had been with him since Chicago, since the moment he'd refused an order and lost everything that had defined him. But at least he'd retained his humanity, his ability to feel and hope and choose. Zithakara had given up even that. "There's something else," she said. "Something you need to know about this place." Marcus waited. "It's not permanent. Pocket dimensions like this are inherently unstable. They collapse eventually, usually within a few years of being created." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. "How long do we have?" "Maybe 5 years, maybe 10. It depends on how much stress we put on the dimensional barriers." She gestured toward the valley, where children were indeed laughing as they played games that looked like nothing from Earth. "More people means faster collapse. More technology means faster collapse. More change means faster collapse. So this is just a temporary reprieve." "Yes, a chance to regroup, to heal, to decide what comes next." She turned those empty eyes toward him. "Your people will need leadership for that decision. They'll need someone who understands both hope and sacrifice." Marcus felt the weight of expectation settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. "What about you?" "I told you, I'm just here." But even as she said it, Marcus saw something flicker in those starlight eyes. Not hope, that was too much to ask for. But maybe, possibility. Over the next few months, Marcus learned more about their new home than he'd ever wanted to know. The pocket dimension was indeed beautiful, filled with wonders that made Earth seem drab by comparison, but it was also fragile, held together by quantum forces that responded to emotion and intention in ways that human science couldn't explain. When people were happy, the dimension stabilized. When they were angry or fearful, reality literally began to unravel at the edges. It was a paradise designed for perfect beings, which humans decidedly were not. The settlement they built was different from the bunker in every conceivable way. Instead of cramped corridors and recycled air, they had open spaces beneath alien skies. Instead of rationed calories and synthesized protein, they had fruits that tasted like memories and water that sang as it flowed. But they were still human. They still argued, competed, loved, hated, hoped, and despaired. And each emotional storm sent ripples through the dimensional fabric that held their world together. Marcus found himself in the role he'd never wanted but somehow always known was coming. Leader of humanity's remnant. Responsible for keeping 3,000 people alive in a place that existed outside the normal rules of physics. It was Zitkara who taught him how to read the warning signs, how to recognize when the dimensional barriers were under stress. She couldn't feel the quantum fluctuations anymore. That connection had been severed when she sacrificed herself to create the portal, but she remembered how they worked. Marcus squinted, trying to perceive whatever she was indicating. To his eyes it was just blue sky with white clouds. "I don't see anything." "The light is bending slightly. About 15 degrees off normal. That means a dimensional fracture is forming." She was right. Within hours, that section of sky began to show stress patterns, cracks in reality itself, revealing glimpses of the empty void beyond their pocket universe. They'd learned to repair such fractures through a combination of focused meditation and controlled emotional responses. It wasn't easy. Asking humans to think happy thoughts while reality literally cracked around them required a kind of discipline that didn't come naturally to the species. But they managed. Day by day, crisis by crisis, they managed, and slowly, Marcus began to notice something else. Zithkara might claim she was just here, but she was becoming indispensable to their survival. She taught their children about dimensional physics, helped their engineers understand technology that operated on quantum principles, served as a bridge between human instinct and alien knowledge. More importantly, she was beginning to smile again. It started small. A slight upturn of the lips when one of the human children successfully demonstrated a basic quantum manipulation technique. But over time, those smiles became more frequent, more genuine. The empty look in her starlight eyes was slowly being replaced by something else. "You're coming back," Marcus told her one evening as they stood at the edge of their settlement, watching 3 alien suns set behind impossible mountains. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do. You're remembering who you are." Zitkara was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice carried something it had lacked for months: uncertainty. I don't know who I am anymore, Marcus. I'm not HFY. I can never be that again. But I'm not human either. I'm something in between, something that doesn't have a name. Maybe that's exactly what you need to be. She looked at him, confusion written across her features. Think about it. Marcus continued. You're the bridge between our species. You understand both perspectives, both ways of thinking. When the time comes to face the hegemony again, and it will come, we're going to need someone who can think like them but fight for us. When the time comes, Marcus gestured toward the settlement spread out below them. Children playing impossible games, adults learning to work with technologies that bent the rules of physics, families adapting to a reality that shouldn't have been able to exist. You think we're going to stay here forever? Hide in this beautiful cage while Earth burns and the hegemony spreads to other worlds. This dimension won't last forever anyway, Zithkara pointed out. Eventually the quantum barriers will collapse regardless of what we do. Then we make sure they collapse on our terms, not theirs. The idea had been growing in Marcus's mind for weeks, a plan so audacious, so insanely dangerous, that it just might work. The pocket dimension wasn't just a refuge. It was a weapon, a reality bomb waiting for someone brave enough to detonate it. But it would require sacrifices. Terrible, necessary sacrifices. Marcus, Zithkara said quietly. What are you thinking? He told her. He laid out the plan that had been forming in the dark corners of his mind. The strategy that could win them the war at the cost of everything they'd built in this impossible place. When he finished, Zithkara stared at him with an expression he couldn't read. That's the most human thing I've ever heard, she said finally. Is that good or bad? Both, she smiled. Not the empty expression she'd worn for months, but something real, something that reached her starlight eyes. It's gloriously, terrifyingly human. You'd sacrifice paradise itself if it meant saving people you've never met. A month ago, I would have said no. I would have pointed out the logical flaws, the low probability of success, the certainty of death for everyone involved. She paused. Now I think I understand why the hegemony fears your species so much. Over the next year they prepared. Not openly. There was no need to worry the population until the plan was ready to implement. But quietly, carefully, Marcus and Zithkara began laying the groundwork for humanity's return to normal space. It wasn't just a matter of technology. Though that was complex enough. The dimensional portal had been a one-way trip, powered by Dr. Kim's sacrifice and Zithkara's connection to the hegemony quantum network, to create another one. A stable one that could transport 3,000 people back to Earth would require resources they didn't have and knowledge they were still learning. But more than that, it would require a new kind of sacrifice. The pocket dimension was held together by quantum forces that responded to consciousness itself. To tear a hole large enough for mass evacuation, they would need to channel the combined will of everyone in the settlement. Their hopes, fears, dreams, and desperation into a single focused effort. And that level of emotional energy, released all at once, would tear their sanctuary apart. There's no coming back from this, Zithkara warned him as they ran calculations late one night. Once we destabilize the dimensional matrix, this place ceases to exist. Everyone who goes through the portal makes it back to Earth. Everyone who doesn't dies, Marcus finished. I know. So who stays behind? Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring at equations that described the death of a world in terms of quantum mechanics and emotional resonance. I do, he said finally. Marcus. Someone has to channel the dimensional energy. Someone has to make sure the portal stays stable long enough for everyone else to get through. And someone has to make sure the hegemony can't follow us back. Then I stay too. No. Marcus, this isn't a discussion. You'll need help with the quantum matrices. Someone who understands dimensional manipulation. I need you on Earth. Our people are going to arrive in the middle of a war zone. And they're going to be confused, scared, probably half dead from dimensional transition. They'll need leadership from someone who understands both human nature and hegemony tactics. There are others who could. There are no others. Marcus's voice carried 3 years of accumulated frustration. Look around, Zithkara. Look at what we've built here. A society where humans and aliens work together, where technology serves life instead of destroying it, where children can grow up without fear. He gestured toward the window, beyond which their impossible city sparkled in the light of 3 suns. This is what Earth could become if we win the war, but it won't happen by accident. It'll take someone who understands both species, someone who can build bridges instead of walls. He met her starlight eyes. It'll take someone like you. Zithkara stared at him for a long moment. Then she did something he'd never seen her do before. She cried. "I can't lose you too," she whispered. "Not after everything. You won't lose me. I'll be right there with you in everything you build, every choice you make, every bridge you construct between our peoples." Marcus reached out and took her hand, pale skin against darker flesh. Alien and human, the future made manifest. Besides, someone has to make sure you don't get too logical about it. Despite her tears, Zithkara almost smiled. Too logical? You still think like a HFY sometimes. All strategy and calculation and cost-benefit analysis. But humans, we do things because they're right, not because they make sense. And staying behind to die is right? Staying behind so 3,000 people can live. Yeah, that's about as right as it gets. The next few months passed in a blur of preparation and barely contained emotion. They couldn't tell the general population what was coming. The dimensional matrix was too sensitive to large-scale emotional disturbance. But word began to spread anyway, carried on whispers and meaningful glances. People began to understand that their time in paradise was ending. Some were angry, some were terrified. A few even suggested they should stay, accept the eventual collapse of their dimension rather than risk the unknown dangers of returning to Earth. But most, the vast majority, began to prepare for war. Because that's what humans did. When faced with impossible choices, they picked the one that let them stand and fight. Marcus found himself thinking about Chicago again, about the choices he'd made and the prices he'd paid. He'd refused to sacrifice civilians for tactical advantage, and it had cost him his career, his reputation, his place in the world. Now he was about to sacrifice himself for the same principle, and somehow it felt like coming full circle. 2 days before the planned evacuation, Zithkara came to him with a proposal that made his blood freeze. "I found another way," she said without preamble. Marcus looked up from the portal calculations he'd been reviewing. "Another way to do what?" "To power the dimensional gate. Instead of using your life force as the primary energy source, we could tap directly into the dimension's collapse. Channel the death of this entire reality into opening a pathway home." That sounds even more dangerous than the original plan. It is, but it would work, and it would mean you could come with us. Marcus studied the equations she'd brought him, trying to understand the implications of what she was proposing. The math was elegant, terrifying, and utterly beyond anything human science had ever attempted. "The energy release would be enormous," he said slowly, "like detonating a star inside a soap bubble." "Exactly. The dimensional backlash would propagate across multiple realities, potentially damaging the hegemony's quantum network throughout this entire sector." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. How much damage? Conservative estimate: it would knock out their dimensional manipulation capabilities for months, possibly years. And the optimistic estimate? Zithkara's smile was sharp as a blade. It would give them a very personal demonstration of why humans are too dangerous to leave alive. The implications were staggering. Instead of simply escaping back to Earth, they would be returning with a weapon that could cripple the hegemony's technological advantage. It wouldn't win the war. Nothing could do that overnight, but it would give humanity a fighting chance. "What's the catch?" Marcus asked, because there was always a catch. "The portal will only be stable for minutes, maybe seconds, and the dimensional collapse will be violent. Anyone still in the pocket dimension when the cascade begins will die in ways that physics doesn't have words for." "How long to evacuate 3,000 people?" "At maximum throughput. 8 minutes." Marcus did the math. 8 minutes to move 3,000 people through a portal that might collapse at any second, while reality literally disintegrated around them. The margin for error was essentially zero. "We do it," he said. "Marcus, we do it. This is our chance, maybe our only chance, to hit back at them in a way that matters, to show them that humans don't just run and hide. Sith Kara nodded slowly. Then we'd better get started. Dimensional cascade this size takes time to set up properly. The next 2 days blurred together in a frenzy of preparation. They had to modify the portal generators, recalibrate the quantum matrices, and somehow do it all without triggering the dimensional collapse prematurely. More than that, they had to prepare 3,000 people for a transition that would make their original journey seem like a pleasant stroll. Marcus stood before the assembled population on the morning of the evacuation, looking out at faces he'd come to know over the past few years. Families who'd survived the fall of Earth, children who'd grown up in impossible beauty, adults who'd learned to build something better from the ashes of everything they'd lost. "I won't lie to you," he said, his voice carrying across the valley through speakers that turned sound waves into quantum vibrations. "What we're about to attempt is dangerous beyond anything we've ever faced. Some of us might not make it through the transition. But if we succeed, if we make it back to Earth, we'll return with knowledge and weapons that could change the course of the war. We'll have a chance to take our world back, to build something like what we've created here, but permanent. Real." He paused, meeting as many eyes as he could. "The choice is yours. Anyone who wants to stay, who thinks the risk is too great, can remain here. This dimension will collapse eventually, but it might last another year or two. You could have that time in peace." No one moved. "All right then," Marcus said, feeling something that might have been pride swell in his chest. "Let's go home." The evacuation began at dawn. They'd organized it like a military operation. Families with children first, then the elderly and injured, then essential personnel, then everyone else. The portal generators hummed with barely contained power, reality bending around them like heated glass. At the portal's edge, Zithkara monitored the dimensional readings, calling out status updates as each group passed through. First wave successful. Portal stability at 96%. Second wave through. 94%. Third wave. 91% and falling. Dimensional cascade beginning. Zithkara called out, her voice tight with concentration. Energy release in 30 seconds. The last group of evacuees approached the portal: engineers and security personnel, the people who'd stayed behind to make sure everyone else got out safely. "Marcus," one of them called. "Time to go." He shook his head. "Someone has to monitor the cascade, make sure it doesn't collapse the portal prematurely." "Marcus, no. Go." "That's an order." They went, disappearing into the portal with expressions of grief and understanding. They'd known this moment was coming, had prepared for it as best they could. Now it was just Marcus and Zithkara, alone in a paradise that was about to become hell. 15 seconds. She reported, her hands flying over the control systems. "Cascade is building. Portal stability dropping to 87%. Around them, the valley began to change. The impossible colors of the alien flowers started to fade, bleeding away like watercolors in rain. The singing trees fell silent, their crystal bark cracking and falling to the ground in shimmering fragments. 10 seconds. 79%. Marcus looked at Zithkara, memorizing the concentration on her face, the way her starlight eyes reflected the dying light of their collapsing world. "You know," he said, conversationally, "this isn't how I expected to die." "How did you expect to die?" she asked, not taking her eyes off the readings. "Old age. In bed. Probably complaining about the weather." "Despite everything," she smiled. "That's very human." "Yeah, well, we're a disappointing species that way." 5 seconds. Zithkara announced. "Marcus, the portal's still stable. You..." "No. We stay. We finish this." The dimensional cascade began. It started as a whisper, reality sighing as it prepared to let go. Then it became a roar, a sound like the universe screaming in pain and rage and desperate hope. The portal flared brilliant white, and Marcus felt the pull of it, the promise of home and safety in a future he would never see. Beside him, Zithkara maintained her focus on the controls, her alien features set in lines of absolute determination. She was channeling everything she had left into keeping the portal stable for a few more seconds, buying time for the cascade to propagate through dimensional space. The valley around them began to dissolve, structures and landscapes fading into static, as the quantum matrix that held everything together finally gave way. Cascade propagating. Zithkara called out over the growing roar. Dimensional shock waves spreading through local cluster. Impact on hegemony network in 3, 2. The explosion, when it came, was not visible or audible. It was something deeper than sight or sound. A fundamental alteration in the way reality worked, spreading outward at speeds that made light seem sluggish. Marcus felt it pass through him like a wave of liquid fire, carrying with it the dying dreams of a paradise and the birth cries of hope itself. On 1,000 worlds, hegemony quantum networks flickered and died. Dimensional gateways collapsed. Conversion fields stopped converting. For the first time in their species' history, the HFY found themselves truly vulnerable. And on Earth, 3,000 humans materialized in the ruins of Manhattan, carrying with them knowledge and technology that would change everything. Marcus never saw any of it. The last thing he saw was Zithkara turning toward him. Her starlight eyes bright with something that might have been love, might have been gratitude, might have been the simple recognition of one soul acknowledging another. "Thank you," she said, her words somehow audible over the roar of a dying universe. Then the dimensional cascade reached its peak, and Marcus Reeves, construction foreman, reluctant leader, bridge builder between species, became part of the light that would guide humanity home. The memorial stood in Central Park, where the old bunker entrance had once been hidden beneath innocuous maintenance covers. It was simple, a black granite wall inscribed with names in both English and flowing HFY script. At the top, larger than the others, 2 names were etched in letters that caught the morning light. Marcus Reeves, bridge builder. Zethkara Kuthmaran, the one who chose. Dr. Elena Kim. Alive again, though she couldn't explain how, laid fresh flowers at the base of the memorial. Beside her, a small group of children played games that would have been impossible before the war, their laughter carrying on a breeze that smelled of hope and growing things. The war was over, not ended. That had taken 3 more years of fighting after humanity had learned to use dimensional technology and alien converts had joined the resistance. But truly finished, with both species working together to rebuild what had been lost. It hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, betrayals, moments when it seemed like the old hatred would win out over the possibility of something better. But they'd had a guide, a teacher who understood both species, who could build bridges where others saw only walls. Kim looked up at the statue that dominated the memorial, a figure in flowing robes, neither fully human nor fully alien, hands outstretched as if offering something precious to the world. The inscription at its base was simple. "Someone has to choose differently." Kim smiled, remembering the man who'd said those words in a bunker beneath Manhattan when the world was ending and hope seemed impossible. Instead, he'd died saving everyone, and had somehow managed to complain about the universe's sense of timing right up until the end. It was, she thought, a very human way to go. Behind her, the children's laughter grew louder, and Kim turned to see them playing a new game. One where humans and young HFY worked together to build impossible structures from light and dreams and pure determination. The future, taking shape one choice at a time.